Welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV. We're discussing whether Britain should become a republic this evening. The decision to bestow a knighthood on Tony Blair is just one aspect of a system that seems outdated in the 21st century. Just over 30 years ago, Tony Benn proposed the Commonwealth of Britain Bill. This was actually seconded by Jeremy Corbyn. The provisions of the bill would have abolished the monarchy, disestablished the Church of England, empowered MPs and peers to appoint the head of state, replaced the Privy Council with an open and accountable body, abolished the House of Lords, made county court judges and magistrates subject to an election process, ended British jurisdiction in the north of Ireland, reformed the judiciary and created a national legal service, reduced the voting age to 16, introduced a codified constitution, and required MPs to swear an oath to the constitution, not to the crown. Now, joining us to discuss these issues tonight is Steve Freeman. He's a member of the University and College Union, a member of the Labour Left Alliance, and he's also the convener for the LLA's Republican Labour Working Group. So let's start with that Tony Blair knighthood, if we can, Steve. Was it the Queen's decision alone to bestow a knighthood on?
Well, not all knighthoods are, but the Garter Knights, the Garter Knights, which goes back to, I think, Edward III in the 1348, set up a special order of knights, 24 knights, as it were. They are appointed by the Queen. Now, they will include special, I mean, I think they appointed Camilla to be with the female equivalent of the knights. But they also, it's become the tradition to appoint, I think, former prime ministers. And I did see it mentioned that Gordon Brown and David Cameron and Theresa May are all waiting in their queue. It was a bit of a bed blocker with Tony Blair. He never got round to giving him this, and now they did, so the way's open for them to come in and get there. So in some ways, I think it's like the elite, really. It's the closest elite, because all these people have worked so closely with the Queen. They know all the secrets, they know how it all works. And that puts them in a very special position within the ruling part of our society. So, It's not just an honour. I think it's come from knowledge. It's come from those working relationships as well. So it's not just a patronage thing. I think it's it. But it's the Queen that... The Queen, obviously, there's some tradition in who she appoints, but she appoints that. It's not down to Boris Johnson, unlike other knighthoods, I think, where the Prime Minister probably has some say. I mean, I don't know.
It's interesting because some of the reaction when I put out the advertising blurb on my social media platforms for tonight's discussion and made the point in that about the Queen bestowing the knighthood on Tony Blair. Some people responded saying, well, it wasn't her decision. She was acting on advice. But my understanding was, which seems to be confirmed by what you've just said, is that this particular type of knighthood is the Queen's decision and the Queen's decision alone.
Yes. I mean, we've always got to remember that the Queen, the official way in which the system works is that the Queen does have no politics at all. But we don't know that because we're not in these private conversations. If she made political statements, which she does occasionally, it would call into question the very existence of the monarchy. So a very strict protocol, as it were, to keep the monarchy is that the monarchy is not political. But we don't necessarily have to believe that. And we know in all sorts of ways in which the Queen has influence through the Queen's consent on legislation and the chance to see legislation. She's got such a privileged position within the system. It would be unbelievable that a millionaire, somebody very rich, wouldn't have some say in what's going on. And we know from articles in The Guardian that indeed she does that. So I think we should be wary of saying that all the Queen just exists to prove that we're a democracy by proving that she has absolutely no power whatsoever. And she just is like Boris Johnson's glove puppet. She just does what he says. Obviously, if it comes to a crisis, she might have to intervene. She wouldn't be able to do that very often and survive. But so they would never do that unless it was in a really tricky situation where she had to intervene and do something quite decisive. So that's the way it is.
I mean, just in terms of getting into the meat of the conversation this evening, Stephen, you've been a Republican for most of your life, I think, and I just want to if you could maybe set out, why you think Britain should become a republic. I mean, not just in relation to the issue about bestowing knighthoods on people, which I think many people like Tony Blair, which many people don't think merits any form of honour. Actually, I think a lot of people think he should be behind bars as a war criminal. But obviously, we had Tony Benn's bill, Commonwealth of Britain Bill, which was much more wide-ranging than simply, abolishing the monarchy. There were a lot of more kind of, fundamental issues in relation to this whole question. So, obviously, I've mapped out in very summary version my opening remarks. But what do you think? Maybe just a little bit of context and lead to my sort of overarching sort of summary of what that was all about.
Okay. I'll make just one other point now in relation to Tony Blair's knighthood. I think that the people who seem strongly motivated by this are particularly concerned because of his record with the Iraq and Afghan wars. That's the thing that motivates people. The actual petition calls upon the Prime Minister to call upon the Queen to rescind this. You could imagine anything more bizarre than that. But that's what the petition does. It's got a million supporters. But I think we as socialists should draw attention to the fact we're not looking for the Crown to do this. But what we should highlight is the fact that because of the Iraq war, Tony Blair's position is the very opposite of Julian Assange. So on one hand, we've got Tony Blair being given his highest award, and we've got, on the other hand, the person who perhaps ought to be our hero, who's exposed of the crimes that have gone on, is now languishing in terrible conditions in jail. And I think that these are moments when those things, why, if 1 million people can sign a petition against his knighthood, can 1 million people sign a petition demanding Julian Assange's release? And I think that's what we as socialists should be saying in this situation. We should link those questions together.
Yeah,
but Tony Benn, I mean, come back to the point that you made, and I'll just come in here, that in his bill, and I think you probably mentioned, but he has a clause 44 in his bill, which says that there should be no personal title or rank or hereditary, whether hereditary or not, should be recognised by law. And that for Republicans, it's not that just Tony Benn we're worried about, it's that the whole system of honours that we are opposing, not just the gift of this one particular example, which has its own particular circumstances. And as you say quite rightly, this is what a lot of people don't understand, which if you read Tony Benn's book, he's got an excellent book, I think, of people that he wrote with Andrew Hood, just up here called Common Sense. You may or may not have seen that, but that's a very good book. It sets out his case. And the point to make is, and people think that Republicanism is about just abolishing the Queen, and we'll just everything else will carry on the same. What Benn's bill demonstrates to us that it's a program, it's a whole series of democratic reforms. It's not a single issue campaign, isn't republicanism? It's about all the way in which our system of government functions. It's a big issue. It's not one person or how would we be without the Queen. A lot of left republicanism seems to mix itself up with what you might call anti-monarchism, confuse the two. They're not the same thing. Getting rid of the Queen is not really what Republicans are about. I mean, obviously, we're keeping the monarchy, but the Republican argument is essentially an argument about democracy, and that's how we have to pitch it. We have to take the democratic argument. So, if I could then come on to what you just asked me and make a few comments about that, because the question that I was going to address, or I'm addressing, it says why Britain should become a republic. And I thought I'd try to get the shortest answer for that and then elaborate on it a little bit. So I'll give a 2-point answer to the question why. Okay, why? So the first one is because of the democratic deficit that always needs to be addressed. So I put democratic deficit, and I'm going to say what I think that means, because that in itself could be a contested idea. And then the second one is that we're living through a deep crisis of our democracy, which, of course, our democracy in the UK takes the form of a constitutional monarchy in which sovereignty is based on, or sovereignty or authority, if you like, is based on this rather strange term, the Crown in Parliament. which seems to suggest that authority is divided between the Crown and Parliament, as if the Queen doesn't really do much in all of that, it's mainly Parliament. But the Crown, of course, is not the Queen. The Crown is all those institutions of state. It's the whole system of government in Whitehall who can, as it were, influence Parliament. And if you had to say, where was the balance of power between the Crown and Parliament? We see every day that the Crown controls the whole. I mean, you'll know this far better than I will, Chris, that the Crown controls the agenda, it controls really, and more or less through the whips and all the rest of it, controls what that goes on in the Palace of Westminster. So the real point is that we're in this crisis of democracy. So, so I want to just elaborate on those 2 points. Let's just take the democratic deficit. I think that's okay. This is a term that's people are very familiar with. It's been widely used, and back in the 80s, it was used by Charter 88 that had a campaign for democracy. I don't know if, Chris, you remember that.
I do.
They use the term the democratic deficit. But it's often presented as if these are sort of things we forgot to do, the sort of outstanding things we never did. We sort of forgot, some sort of collective amnesia, like we forgot to abolish the House of Lords, so perhaps we should just fit that out. But perhaps we didn't bother to have elections for the head of state. So they're just sort of little bits of leftover from the past, just, which we don't need to bother with. And I think that's to really misunderstand what the democratic deficit is. I would define it as all those things that are designed to exclude working class people from having the right to decide and the right to control their lives. So it's not an accident, therefore, it's a deliberate policy. In other words, those in power will try to maintain this democratic deficit, and they'll only concede a little bit with a struggle. Those in power, and I would say that so we have a democratic deficit in the Labour Party that you will be more than well aware of. We have a democratic deficit in our trade unions. We have them in our workplaces. We have them in our local communities, and of course, last but not least, in our forms of national government, in our constitution. So it's kind of all there in multiple ways, more than I can think about how that comes in. And given that we're a union state in the United Kingdom, there's also a democratic deficit in Northern Ireland. There's one in Scotland, there's one in Wales, and last but not least, one in England, which I will come on to say a little bit more about in a minute. So I think that, you can certainly see struggles over democracy in Northern Ireland, and you can see them in Scotland, and you can see them in Wales. It's a bit more difficult to see them in England, and that's a point in itself. So I think that republicanism, properly understood, is about a long historical struggle going over decades or even centuries to kind of, as it were, to end the democratic deficit. And that's what I think republicanism is essentially about. It's not primarily about ending hereditary institutions like the monarchy or the Lords, although it is that. It's more to do with the power that we've got in our society is massively bureaucratic. It's the unelected and the unaccountable. The Crown, therefore, is not simply to be equated with the monarch. It's almost like a huge corporate body that employs millions of workers, the civil service, and that power it brings in to dominate our society. So if you like, in that context, the Queen, this is a kind of corporate entity, not an individual thing. The Queen is a bit like the chair of the board, and Boris Johnson's like the chief executive who manages it on a day-to-day basis. There is an interesting report, again, Chris, you're probably aware of this, about the Hillsborough football tragedy, the one in 2017. Especially if you're a football fan, you'll be aware of this as well. And the title of it, I think, gets to it. It calls it the title of this report is The Patronising Disposition of Unaccountable Power. And they're talking about what they discovered through the struggle for the victims of the Hillsborough tragedy. And what they discovered in trying to take 30 years to carry on this struggle, to try to get to the truth of what was going on, that power was patronisingly disposed and unaccountable, and they were struggling to gain accountability for what actually took place. And I think that is not about just about the Queen, but it's about how the whole system operates. So let me just take the second point from that. Just look at my notes a second. I wanted to just then talk a little bit about the crisis of democracy, because I think this is a second strand of the story. Now, I think that a crisis of democracy means that the old system can't sustain itself anymore. It's come to a point where people are become so disillusioned in it that the system becomes sort of unstable. And I think that's what's been happening since the 2008 financial crisis, the banking crisis, and since the harsh austerity politics that's been carried out since then, that people in this country have become more and more disillusioned with the democracy we have and don't think it can solve their problems. Now, there are many aspects of that. One of those aspects was the 2014 Scottish referendum. If you think 45% of Scottish people are voting to leave, saying goodbye, we want to go. That's not 50%, obviously. But hey, 45% is like massive, isn't it? That's a real vote of no confidence in what they call the Westminster system. And then, of course, if you even the election of Jeremy Corbyn, that's really people in the Labour Party. Then we've had enough of the way this has been going. They've turned to something sort of a bit left field, something you would never have expected to have happened, to elect Jeremy Corbyn, a completely sort of fringe member of the Labour Party, and all of a sudden becomes a leader. And that's a sign of the deep dissatisfaction with austerity and the desire to do something else, which poses, as you did, Chris, yourself, the crisis of democracy in the Labour Party. And I really remember you going around the country with the Democracy Roadshow, I think it was called. So that posed the crisis of democracy in the Labour Party. And then, of course, the European Union referendum in 2016. And again, in England, the vote was to leave the European Union, but the winning arguments in England, I still think, as well, there was a racist element to that, but the winning argument was, let's take back control. Now, I'm not going to say that we did take back control, but it was a popular argument. People were persuaded, but generally by the right wing, that we couldn't control our own democracy now because of the European Union. And therefore, if we left the European Union, we could sort of get our democracy back. Now, get it back is take back control. Well, we never had it in the first place. So, let's not run with that one. But the point was that desire for more democracy. And then the Tories have been using these sort of democratic slogans like get Brexit done, you voted for it, we're going to get it done. They took the democratic message more powerfully than the Labour Party's confused message at the last election. Now, I had was a little quote, and I think it gets to me, one from Gordon Brown. I'll give you one quote, which I think gets to the idea that our democracy is in a real crisis and is sort of dying. There's one here from a report which apparently was commissioned for the leader of the opposition's office by a guy called Sean Griffin. And this report says there's an existential crisis facing the British state. It says it's plagued by huge economic and political imbalances and inordinate centralisation of power and wealth, vast regional inequalities across the UK, an empty commitment to devolution. The old constitution, it says, is creaking under the weight of competing nationalisms, identity politics, and the disconnect between ordinary people and the British political and economic elite centred on Westminster and the City of London. And I think that message is really what I'm talking about. That is a message that we need to get. The system is in a kind of zombified democracy. It might still look like it, but it isn't really there anymore. And the big danger of this, the big danger that we face is two, and we can see that one path out of this crisis of democracy is towards authoritarianism. If democracy is not working, why not somebody like Mussolini who could come along and make everything work again? Why not have an authoritarian figure? Why not, or even the direction towards fascism if the system is not working? Or the other side of that, because there's always two ways out of this. The other side is that we actually need a new democracy. We actually need a new constitutional settlement that can address all these problems. And that then, as it were, takes us back to what Tony Benn was talking about in 1991, 1993, 1996. Now, you read out, Chris, I had in my notes was going to read out some of those points, but you've already done that, so that's saving up a bit of time. Thank you very much. But those points show that it's a full Republican and Democratic program. And I want to take one point out of there and just highlight this for you. I don't know how I'm doing time because I've not been watching the time. Are we doing all right?
You're okay. We're at 20 past now. 21.
Okay. What Tony Benn's bill calls for, because he's calling for a federal solution to the problems, okay? But he calls for parliaments for England, Scotland and Wales, not Northern Ireland, because he wants to see the link with Ireland ended. So he calls for these parliaments. And of course, that shows he's in touch with what's going on in the early 1990s. Because of the poll tax, there is a movement for democracy in Scotland, through the anti-poll tax movement. There is a desire for the Scottish Parliament. So, of course, in 1997 and 1998, when Tony Blair comes into power, he gives a new assembly through the Good Friday Agreement to Northern Ireland and parliaments to Scotland and Wales. Well, I think the Welsh one was an assembly, not having lawmaking powers originally, but that's obviously gone on since that point. And I distinguish between a parliament that makes law and an assembly that doesn't. So, but anyway, they got to those points. But the big missing point in all of this is what happened to the parliament for England, and why didn't we get a parliament for England that's in Benn's bill? So I think that we should take notice of this other feature, which is the democratic deficit specifically in England, and the failure of the left in England to address the problems and divisions within England, not least the North-South divide and various other things of that character. 85% of people live in England. 85% of the working class is in England. We have the largest democratic deficit in the whole of the UK, not having those parliaments, and even the biggest, most centralised population in the whole of Europe that doesn't have its parliament. All we have to do is sort of feed off the scraps from the Westminster clown show, the British Imperial Parliament, which never really has any time to address these questions. So I think the lack of democracy in England is making people angry and disillusioned, but unfortunately, it's not making them more left-wing. It's making them a bit more right-wing. So I think we can see that in the 2019 general election. Scotland and Wales took, if you like, more the social democratic options. They've got their own prime ministers, but both Scottish nationalists and Welsh Labour are preventing a more social democratic, more Labour Party approach. Whereas in England, of course, what you've got is that the people in England voted Tory. But the Tories appealed, because the Tories appealed with, as I said before, Chris, the Tories appealed with democratic arguments about getting Brexit done. And then they borrowed some of Jeremy Corbyn's clothes by talking about levelling up and the North-South divide and all these other promises, empty promises, by the way, but nevertheless promises to appeal to people that they were going to do that. So I would, and this doesn't go back to this, I'll come towards it, and I would say that we have to argue that England also, we should take up the demand for a new parliament in England. Perhaps it should be located in the Midlands so that you don't have to travel so far from Derby to attend. It should be founded on the sovereignty of the people, maybe with annual elections, the Levellers call for that, with MPs elected accountable, subject to recall, and maybe pay the average income of the people they're representing. Now, that would be, I think, a democratic program. That doesn't contradict the idea of Britain, by the way, becoming a republic. If England becomes a republic, it would encourage those similar movements that are already taking place, by the way, in Wales and Scotland, because Wales and Scotland are already moving in that direction anyway. And obviously, we in England must in any case be standing in the way of those developments in Wales and Scotland and in Ireland. But that could lead us then in the direction, if England was to go forward instead of being the backward part of this whole thing, if England was to go forward, that might lead us eventually to Tony Benn's idea that we had a voluntary federal republic, which was Benn's own conclusion. not by it being imposed upon Scotland and Wales and Ireland by England, but rather all these people coming to establish their own sovereignty, their own democracy, a kind of democracy that comes from the citizens, from below, that is grassroots-based democracy, which goes in parallel with workplace democracy, goes in parallel with making our trade unions more democratic, and of course, last but not least, a democratic Labour Party, which seems highly unlikely, but would have been a good idea if it wasn't. And I'll end on this point. It's worth remembering that the term Commonwealth, which Benn uses, actually does go back to 1649. It does go back, and Benn was a regular attender at the May Festival in Burford in Oxfordshire, where the Levellers had their last stand. And England became a Commonwealth in January 1649. It was the promise of a better society, but as we know, a counter-revolution came in. The Levellers were all arrested and locked up. And less well known is that in May 1649, 800 women dressed in green dresses, which was the Leveller colour, demonstrated outside the House of Commons for the release of the Levellers. And of course, the Diggers were also active. They were trying to make this democratic. The Levellers were trying to make the Republic more democratic, and the Diggers were trying to make it a social republic, i.e. what they wanted to do was take over the land, to be able to feed the people. They were a movement to get control of the land so that people could feed themselves. They were also defeated. And I think that's where we go back to. I think we go back to saying, obviously this is the 21st century. It's not the 17th century. But nevertheless, there's a great inspiration from our fantastic democratic, republican, social traditions that Tony Benn fully understood when he called his bill the Commonwealth Bill. And I think that we therefore should take that up. And I think that would be probably a good place to stop at this point.
No, well, thanks. That was really fascinating. A really useful sort of summary, Steve, of the position. And your point, I think, is absolutely well made, in my view, anyway, in relation to the Diggers, the Levellers. We certainly, in my view, need a 21st century version of the Levellers and the Diggers. And given the number of food banks that are springing up, and access to good quality food for people is a real issue in the 21st century. It's an absolute stain on what's supposed to be a civilized society in the world. But I just want to pick up on one or two of the comments before I bring in Sean, who will just run through some of the comments from our viewers this evening. First off, I just wanted to sort of ask you, just slightly tangential, but your point about the English seemingly voting in a more right-wing trajectory. Well, in 2017, there was the biggest increase in vote share for the Labour Party on a relatively radical proposition. I think it could have been a lot more radical than it was, but considering where we've been for the last 4 decades, it's a breath of fresh air. So, just on your point in relation to how things went in 2019, do you think that's a reflection of the opinion of the British people, or is it a failure of the left in this country to put forward a proposition that was sufficiently attractive for people?
I think my answer to that would have been yes. And just to say as a corrective, I think that Brexit was, by and large, was something taken over by the right and led by the right. And I think the equivalent, Jeremy Corbyn was the left-wing equivalent of the same process that's going on. The disillusionment that people felt in that period manifested itself in Jeremy Corbyn's movement and in the idea that if we left the European Union, we could get our democracy back and make things better. I think both of those things were different sides. So you're right with both of those things. Why did Jeremy Corbyn? Okay, so there's a lot of reasons. Are you asking me why did Jeremy Corbyn lose in 2019?
Well, no. There's more a point about. Okay, no, there's more a point. Was it a failure of the left? I mean, are people moving right, or is it a failure of the left?
Yes.
To actually put forward a proposition which is sufficiently attractive? Is it?
Yes.
Is it the public that's going right wing, or is it the left which had failed them?
Okay, I'll go for
Which
the
is leaving them
latter.
in a-
I will go for the latter because the logic of my position would have been that if Jeremy Corbyn, when he came to power, could have taken the Bennite route rather than a route, the route that he did take, which was essentially saying he was loyal to the Constitution, the Crown in Parliament, and he would work within that system. He wouldn't disturb that. He hoped that he could become Her Majesty's Prime Minister and then carry out these reforms. That's the way it was going. He wasn't taking the lessons. I think what Tony Benn did in 1991, he set out a program that is still our future. Even though it wasn't taken up by the left, he's still pointing out to us, this is the benchmark that we have to achieve. Now, Jeremy Corbyn didn't win the Labour Party leadership on the Bennite program, in this Bennite program, that's true. But he may have had a chance where, had he been mobile enough, he could have gone back, especially when they tried to overthrow him a second time, by the way, the second thing, he could have gone back and said, we've got to go further now. We need to be much more democratic. You've tried to overthrow me. Now I'm going to go back now and put a more democratic. And he could have put he could have put an updated version of the Benn program that would have been quite appealing to people. And it would have been quite clearly distinct from what Boris Johnson was doing, because Boris Johnson stole some of Corbyn's clothes and tied it into Brexit. And Jeremy Corbyn, therefore, it was difficult because Corbyn was meanwhile getting tied up with Starmer, so really the program was a kind of Corbyn-Starmer program, really, is what he was trying to deal with. So I think there's a seeds of a defeat was that even if he had not won in 2019, but had put forward a Republican Bennite type program, even if he'd been defeated, he would have changed the consciousness of people in this country about what we need to do. So he could have been defeated and left a very important democratic legacy behind him. Whereas I can't see that he's left that because of the program that he did stand on, which basically Starmer said, I'll carry it out, but I'm going to make it much more patriotic. And we'll fly flags.
I mean, to be honest with you, Steve, my view on all that is that it's not, obviously Jeremy has to take his share of the blame, but it's not entirely Jeremy's fault. All of the pressure that was being applied in the parliamentary Labour Party was coming from the right wing, and obviously from outside of the parliamentary Labour Party too, in the fourth estate and media and all the rest of it, and the oligarchs and faceless corporations, etc. I sort of blamed the Socialist campaign group, and I used to plead with the campaign group to not just be cheerleaders for everything that Jeremy and John McDonnell were saying, but to actually be pushing them to go further, to create the space. And they were just a waste of space, frankly, the Socialist campaign group. They were bloody useless. But the point I was just going to make, though, I was just saying that as an aside, you might want to comment on that in a minute as well, Steve. But the question I was going to ask is that, you talked about Jeremy coming to the fore, and that was a reflection that, people were fed up inside the Labour Party. But does it also not illustrate that, notwithstanding what happened in 2008, the crisis of capitalism, they are still incredibly powerful and influential and will fight like dogs to ensure that their privileged position pertains? Because everything was thrown at Jeremy, wasn't it? Absolutely everything. He got the Zionist lobby, obviously. He got the military-industrial complex. You got generals saying they wouldn't tolerate a Corbyn government if it was to cut defence spending or scrap Trident, etc. So there was all the forces of the state were thrown at Jeremy and that Corbyn project, and ultimately destroyed it. And now, obviously, I think there's mistakes to be made. He should have fought them more vociferously. I think certainly the Socialist campaign got a waste of space. But you talked about that crisis. How optimistic are you that a sort of a radical democratic alternative, a Bennite sort of alternative, a Republican Bennite democratic alternative has a chance of prevailing? Or is it more likely that we're going to go down the authoritarian fascist route, a Mussolini, a 21st century Mussolini type thing?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to, before I answer to that, which is a very, very important point, I didn't want to get round to thinking I want to blame Jeremy Corbyn for what went wrong. I think that's completely wrong. A lot of people do. I think that's all wrong. It's like people are built up to be heroes and then they're knocked down. You know, Jeremy Corbyn was the voice of a movement. The movement just happened to pick him, and he just happened to be picked out. They could have picked John McDonnell, or it could have been anybody else. So I don't think we need to get into that. You could certainly say that if the movement had been Republican, which it wasn't, then they would have been pulling him up and saying, "Wait a minute, where are you going with this?" He would have had the pressure from below on him. And as you say, the campaign group was, you know, I obviously don't know how that thing works, but take what you said. That pressure from the campaign doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
It doesn't
it's
work. It's a bloody
waste of space, mate.
Yeah. So I'm arguing. A lot of people think, and I'm arguing something different, that somehow the Jeremy Corbyn program was correct. It just went wrong. You should try again. Whereas I'm saying, no, the problem is that the Jeremy Corbyn program that he had in 2019 isn't the correct program for the kind of crisis of democracy that we are facing, the dangers that we're facing. And to argue that, yes, that we're more likely to go down we are already going down, by the way, the authoritarian route in terms of what Boris Johnson's doing. That's a route that they're going to take us more and more down as people resist it. So if I had to guess, are we going to go democratic or authoritarian? I'd probably put my money on going authoritarian. But the mere fact that we can say that also tells us that we must do something about it. We're not just sitting here being victims of it. We have to create that democracy. So we are forced by conditions to take the question of democracy on the left much more seriously. And unfortunately, the left, especially in England, by the way, because the left in Scotland has come to recognise they need a new constitution, new system of government in Scotland. The left in England haven't really worked this one out at all yet. We are really lagging behind. We're reflecting a certain backwardness in England. But the lash of what the right is where the right is going is if we do not wake ourselves up, if we don't have that message, then we are in trouble, dangerously in trouble. So I think that what we've got to do on the left, and I think all those forces on the left of the Labour Party, which are now a little bit disorientated by what we're going to do after the Corbyn defeat, you know, we've got to. I think just like the Crown unites the right, I think republicanism can unite the left as it happens. The Crown and the monarchy is to the right, what republicanism is to the left.
Yeah.
But there's
just on the point that you mentioned, Steve, in relation to the Constitution, and that was one of the cornerstones, really, wasn't it, of the Commonwealth of Britain Bill, a codified constitution. Yes. And like you say, the left, certainly the English left, well, not to my knowledge anyway, haven't really embraced this or looked at this at all. And perhaps you could unpack that a little bit. I mean, why do we need, in your opinion, a codified constitution rather than this kind of nebulous unwritten constitution?
Well, it is about an unwritten one. It is basically so Boris Johnson or the Prime Minister can do what they like, and nobody can tell us that they're not doing it. They can do whatever they like. I mean, that's the thing. And in normal circumstances, that might not appear to matter that much. Maybe it's always been like that. But in the present crisis situation, that's open for Boris Johnson and other forces just to simply go, well, they don't treat the Constitution seriously. They just want us to abide by it and be loyal to it and just, like it's some myth that we've got to abide by. If we think, well, it doesn't really exist. I mean, it does exist, don't get me wrong. But as soon as we start to examine it, it can't stand up to any rational test at all. So the best thing to do is not to think about it. As long as we don't keep thinking about it, then we carry on thinking we can sort things out without doing that. And that's the problem, because if there's a crisis of democracy, we can't avoid the thinking, because it's going to force us. We're going to be forced. If you didn't want to think about it, we're going to be forced to think about it. You know, the conditions in which are emerging will force people to have this kind of discussion we're having now. Has to be had, you know, right across the left, in my opinion.
Yeah, I've had, not recently, but a few years ago, kind of academic conversation about, the pros and cons of a written constitution, a codified constitution versus the unwritten constitution. And, a number of people on the left have said, well, no, a codified written constitution will fetter the ability of an incoming, at that point, I'm Labour government. I think it's going to have to be something different to that. Socialist government, it's not going to happen, in my opinion, under the Labour government. But that will fetter the ability of an incoming, radical socialist government to, effect the change in order to kind of deliver socialism in this country. I mean, how would you respond to that this unwritten constitution gives, you know, a radical government, if you can get one elected, more room to manoeuvre?
No, because it's never going to be used. It's never going to be used by the left. It's only ever going to be used by those people who want to block it. They're going to use that power within there to block it. It's something which is not very democratic is not a weapon of the left. And if we think we can lay hold on a very undemocratic system and somehow wield it for progressive purposes, we're going to come seriously unstuck. But first of all, we'll be accused anyway of acting illegally, of interfering in the way that, you know, all those things. You can imagine the right taking up all those arguments. The real answer is the more democratic, because at the end of the day, it's not we're doing something on behalf of the people. In republicanism, we're thinking of the people doing it for themselves, the people getting the power in their localities, in their trade unions, in their Labour Party to be able to make decisions for themselves. And if we want to codify that in a rational way and make it law, then that's where we have to go to settle that idea. The Levellers had the idea of the agreement of the people. They thought we'll have a constitution and the constitution will be put to the people for agreement. And then we can change it. You know, once you change a constitution, they're stuck with it forever. If circumstances change, you can change the constitution. But it's difficult to change it when you don't know what it is.
Well, there's no perfect system, I suppose, because, you know, we've seen in Latin America where the kind of far right have got in power and, you know, they put in, like in Brazil, I think it was, measures to, you know, limit spending, for example, on education and health and housing, etc. You know, but on the other hand, of course, I mean, from my perspective, coming at it from a kind of progressive socialist radical point of view, I would like to see a constitution that says, you know, poverty will not exist in Britain, in the fifth biggest economy in the world, that people have a right to food and to housing and to free education. Those things I would have thought could have been incorporated into a constitution. And yes, you know, if a right-wing government came into power, I mean, you know, perhaps they could argue for something different. But would you see if a constitution were a codified constitution brought into being? I mean, how would you see amendments being made to that? Would you just leave that to the parliamentarians, or would you say that it should be subject to referenda?
So, I think at the end of the day, if the people are sovereign, the people have to be involved in all of these processes, and they have to be involved in it. And just to go back to a previous point, the phrase that we use in the Republican Labour Working Group is for a democratic and social republic. Now, what we mean by that is a democratic republic, i.e., with all the democratic institutions and democratic mechanisms that you can have. But a social republic doesn't necessarily mean the abolition of capital. It means you have social rights written into the constitution, which could be the right to housing, the right to food, or what, you know, we could discuss what should be the social rights that every member of the Commonwealth has. And Benn was, in his bill, he has the idea of a national legal service, a bit like a national health service. The idea, therefore, that every citizen would have access to the law. So if you could take up your rights in the social rights that you have in the Constitution and have their right, because at the moment the law is just for people with lots of money. It's not for, you know, it's really the laws for them and not for us. Well, in a democratic and social republic, every citizen should have access to the law and have those laws. So, yeah, democratic. I mean, the Commonwealth to me is a democratic and a social republic. It's not just pure democracy, and that would be popular because we are dealing with. We're dealing with rights, not privileges. Under the present system, you might be lucky enough to get some support from the state, but you don't have a right to it. We're talking about rights. We're talking about democratic rights. It's really, at the end of the day, it's all about the citizens having democratic rights and the citizens having social rights. You know, including trade union rights, for example. Lots of other things that we could talk about.
Of course. I mean, just before being shown in to see what reaction we've been getting from viewers this evening. I mean, obviously, we've been subjected to kind of neoliberal orthodoxy for the last 40 plus years in this country. And we saw when Jeremy, we touched on this a little bit already, was elected as the Labour leader and was challenging that, the enemy of neoliberalism, and we saw what happened to it. Do you think that, you know, unless we we have some sort of codified constitution, a republican system in this country, that the ability to replace kind of that neoliberal dominance is possible.
Well, there's an interesting parallel thing going on in Chile right now, because the Chilean constitution, which was a product of the Pinochet regime, and it shows you what a constitution is really all about. If you look from afar on that, they built neoliberalism into the constitution. So they were trying to put it, if you like, the constitution is really the basic law, I suppose. I like that German word, the basic law. So the Chilean constitution was the basic law of Chile. But they'd already baked in, just like Franco did when he gave up power in Spain. He tried to bake in the idea it would be a monarchy, because he wanted to carry on with a system that he thought he'd bequeathed. Now, of course, the popular movement in Chile, which started as a social movement, soon came to realize that if they don't have a new republic in Chile, a new constitution, and that's where they've gone down that road, because they realize they need to change the basic ways in which things work. The law is the constitution is a built-in bias towards the rich, and you can't just ignore that. You've got to do something about it. So you can be a Republican even in a republic. Republicanism is not just confined to people who are living in monarchies like Spain or Sweden or us. America needs you look at America, the way that America works, the way that democracy functions in America, they're in an even bigger crisis of democracy, I believe. And Mussolini, you can see him over there in the shape of Trump. But the system of democracy that they got bequeathed from their revolution gives a bias towards rural areas in their Senate and things like that. And so you've got the working class in the big cities, but the constitution doesn't enable them to get majorities. So even though they've won every presidential vote since I don't know when, they don't always get even democratic presidents. So they're faced with a problem. They need a new constitution because their system is now just polarizing, kind of out of control. And in France, they've got the Fifth Republic, but a lot of people on the left think we have a Sixth Republic. The one we got, no good. Let's have a sixth one then.
Let's have a first. Second Republic for Britain. Second Republic.
Second Republic. Thank you very much. 6 years. We had the first one in 1649.
Yes, indeed, absolutely. Right. Well, let me bring in Sean then. Disembodied Sean. Camera's not working this evening. But Sean, can you tell us what kind of response we've been getting from our viewers this evening?
Hi, Chris. Hi, Steve. Fantastic debate we're having in the chat this evening. Just before I go on to comments, I want to welcome a few new people to the channel. We'll see Phil was here, Jason likes Lenin, and the usual Tiggs, Kevin Rathbone, Jonathan Cooper. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Whilst I've got you here, if you are new to the channel, please leave us a like, as it helps with our the algorithms for our channel, and please subscribe and click the notification bell so that you know when we go live, which is every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Okay, so the first question we have tonight, Steve, comes from the Fat Baker. He says that, Chris, thanks for having Steve on the show. How do you both think we can raise the left Republican position up the agenda?
What do you think, Steve?
Well, I think that the first task in a way that we've got is to first of all start with the left itself. We have to try to convince the left that they should take this seriously. I mean, the number of people on the left who think republicanism is anything other than something from the 17th century and not relevant today is large. So I think there's a big task to do that. And I think that, as I said, because I think republicanism can unite us all, we don't all have to be in the same organisation at this moment in time to find ways to promote and make it a serious proposition for the left to do that. So, I mean, just doing this tonight and doing other things that we're all doing. So at some point we'll have to have some gathering, some event, if you like, that can bring the left together on this sort of basis. And then we've got to take on the forces in the Labour Party. Then we've got to go further than that. Now, whether we'll end up having an independent Republican Party, or whether those Republican forces will be able to do something in the Labour Party, I cannot know in advance. It doesn't necessarily matter at this stage. We've just got to get the few of us that think this is important, have got to get together and find different ways of promoting it, I think, and convincing people that this is the way.
I mean, I think, Steve, as you say, we've made a start this evening, and I know that you spoke at the Resist event at Brighton and joined the Labour Party conference. So we've made a small start, but we need to do a lot more. And before this discussion that we're having this evening, I attended the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition Steering Committee meeting, and one of the items on the agenda was preparing a programme for parliamentary elections whenever they come, a general election. And so one of the things that we could potentially do is maybe introduce this discussion into those deliberations and potentially get a commitment there. And certainly we are going through a process that is the Resist for People's Party, and we're in the process of registering as well as a party. But we'll be talking to members, supporters around the country for views and so on, and we're going to finish up after having those deliberations and discussions with a policy conference. And this, again, for me, it's not down to me, but I'm quite like this to be an element of, indeed a cornerstone of our programme. And if we think we can do that with, as I say, with the Trade Union Socialist Coalition, do it with us and the other parties on the left, then we've got a chance maybe of getting this embraced by a wider audience and then having that conversation with the wider general public.
Well, I'm going to say I quite agree with that. I mean, what we need, using the word small r, small sp, we need a Republican Socialist Party. That is to say, a party which obviously aims at socialism, but actually sees republicanism as its road to, a Republican road to socialism, if you like, is how
well, we haven't picked our name for our party. Our members have voted to register as party. Right. We haven't decided on the name yet. Well, maybe Republican Socialist Party could be it.
Well, it's historic. Interestingly enough, there is a historic name, because if you go back to 1903, there was a debate in what became the Socialist Labour Party at that time, which was one of the components of the Communist Party, and the word Socialist Labour Party won the debate, but the one that was second, that was challenged, was Republican Socialist Party. And I don't know if it was Tom Mann or I can't totally remember off the top of my head who it was, but somebody well known in the Labour movement had tried to persuade them to use the word Republican Socialist Party.
I'm quite attracted by it, but I mean, obviously they don't answer it to members just to whether or not they've done that. But I certainly quite like that. But anyway, Sean, any other comments from our viewers?
Oh yeah, there's lots. Jonathan Cooper says he's excited about ghost or shadow CLPs like New and Socialist Labour, and the campaign that they're doing is the way forward in the immediate future. This is something that I've been thinking about since Corbyn came in, really, was to set up sort of shadow councillors, to hold other councillors, the representative, the elected councillors to account and the councils to account. Do you think that this is something that may work as we're working towards a republicanism or towards a republic? What's your thoughts on that, Steve?
And this is a little off the top of my head, but yes, I think once you realise that republicanism is not about the fairy at the top of the Christmas tree, but is actually about the grassroots. It's people organising locally, people organising democratically. It could be through citizens' assemblies. It could be through the lack of democracy in the Labour Party. Perhaps shadow CLPs might be the way in which democracy could maintain itself in relation to that. So, I think it's the way to go. It's about, if it's people coming together, that's where our republic has to come from. It has to come from below. It's not something that's going to be coming from above. I mean, just to give you an example, we became a republic in 1649. The reason why we became because in the new model army, you already had a sort of republic appearing. So at the end of the day, the struggle between Parliament and the new model army led to the republic pre-existed. The republic was kind of in the Putney debates, for example, the republic pre-existed. So in a way, if we're going to have the idea of republicanism, it's got to grow from the grassroots, from people getting together. That's where it's coming from. It's not really coming from anywhere else. It's just that we don't limit ourselves to that. We have ambitions which go to the whole political system. But if the republic appears before it comes to power, that's the kind of the dual power that exists before. It'll be a dual power before there's a republic, I think.
Yeah,
That's the way we have to see it. So it's not something that wait for somebody at the top to do something about the monarchy. You can do it in Derby. You can do it in any place you are, wherever you are. You can promote citizens' assemblies, democratic organisations of people. And I even say, Chris, you mentioned food banks. I think that because of the crisis, the formation of food banks is people. It's not that we want that, but it is people getting together. It's what we call in Republican citizen activism. It's the citizens getting together to help feed themselves because the state has so failed them. And that's an organisation. That is in my way of thinking, that's a kind of Republican organisation, not called that. It doesn't mean that people got that, but in effect, it's active citizenship. It's people. Civic republicanism was the phrase that's used for it. Civic republicanism. So we should promote civic republicanism. So
last couple of points, Sean. We've got 4 minutes to go.
Yeah. Just one last question then from Atcha John. He said, is there a current model to look at besides the USA? I mean, the USA, as we know, is ruled by corporatism, which can explain what it is we actually want. Where ought we be looking for a social organisation working now in this way? Is there? I think what he's trying to say is there a country that is run on a Republican model that we can base ourselves on?
I think, I'd say no, there isn't. But all the things that we probably talk about have all existed, so they're not impossible things. You can look at historical examples. You can look at places like what happened in Russia. You can see what happened in Paris in 1870. So there are lots of places where republicanism has bubbled up, where people have organised themselves in these ways, but they've never, they've not lasted for very long because the forces they're against are very powerful. So I think we're not advocating something that hasn't existed somewhere. Annual parliaments, all these other things, they've all existed somewhere. So it's not utopian. We're inventing it. If you want to look somewhere, I still recommend you go back and look at Tony Benn's bill just to see what he's saying. Not to necessarily agree with it, but as a good reference point. I still think he's the point. We've got to get beyond Tony Benn, but we need to get everybody up to that level in the first place, so we can go beyond it. Rather than actually where we've been below that level.
John, final comments from anybody?
It's just a brilliant debate that's going on chat. Really, people are talking amongst themselves. I think we're having such a good debate on chat. They're going to have to go back and rewatch this afterwards, and then taking what's been going on the chat. Lots of people saying, we need to work together, resist, break through, nip the socialist Tusk. I will say to people that we are working with all of those different organisations. We're on the steering committee of Tusk, and we're also involved in it's a progressive left alliance, is it, Chris?
Progressive Alliance of the Left.
Yeah, so and which is a coalition really of all of those groups, including Peace and Justice, which is Jeremy Corbyn's campaigning group. So we are involved, we are getting together, we are talking, and we are trying to get together a list of policies or headings that or values that we all agree to. So that we can go forward with this. So I hope that does answer some people's questions to that. But I want to thank everybody for joining in the chat tonight. It's been really great, and I hope we can carry on this.
Absolutely.
Maybe on the Facebook group or on Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, we're out of time. I want to thank Steve for being an excellent guest this evening. And one of the things that we're planning to do in this new year, as we are in now, is to organise a range of webinar discussions for members and supporters of the Resist movement, and maybe Steve could come along and participate in. I just think this is a topic we should return to, because one of the things that we talk about is raising political consciousness, and this is such an important issue where we need to raise political consciousness, and it covers such a vast array of areas really of life in this country that I think getting a better understanding and raising people's consciousness and awareness about what republicanism is about, I think it is really, really crucial. So thanks again, Steve, for your input this evening. Hopefully you'll come back on again and maybe join us in some of these webinar discussions. Thank you everybody for watching this evening. Tune in next week, same time, same place at 7 o'clock. Thanks for watching and good night.